Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, A New Way to Manage Customer Portfolios for Maximum Value. I'm Allison Ryder, Program Director for MIT Sloan Management Review's Big Ideas Research Initiatives, and I'll be your moderator today. First, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Five9, for making this webinar possible. Our speakers today are Fred Selnes and Michael D. Johnson. Fred is a professor of marketing at BI Norwegian Business School and an adjunct professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. Michael is the marketing department chair at the Wisconsin School of Business, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Dean Emeritus and E.M. Statler Professor Emeritus at Cornell University. Fred and Michael, they have many great insights to share from their recent research, so we're going to get started. Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Allison. And good morning from Madison, everyone. For my colleague, Fred, he's joining us from Oslo, Norway. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to handle the first part of this presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Fred about midway, and so we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But before we get started, I want to add, on behalf of both Fred and myself, I want to add our thank you to all the folks, to Allison and all the folks at MIT Sloan Management Review. They've been great supporters of our work over the years, and we're continuing to work with MIT on this work. So this has been a very good partnership. Thank you. The journey that Fred and I have been on has lasted literally almost 20 years. I gave one of the first talks on this topic, Fred, back here in Madison, like in 2003. So between our academic work and our applications in industry, this has been a fun journey for us, and hopefully you'll learn some things this morning and come away with some a better understanding of a concept that we call customer portfolio management. It's really a framework for trying to make better decisions and linking what we do from a marketing standpoint with what we do from a business strategy standpoint. Some of you will see some of the roots of people like Michael Porter in this work and the work he's done in the strategy area. You'll see work on customer satisfaction and loyalty in this work. And it's about merging those into forming really what is a better framework for making business decisions. So let's start with, I think, a story that sort of a couple of companies that got us very interested in this topic very early on. And to set the stage for these examples, you got to think about where we were back in 2000 plus, where we were doing a lot of research in a lot of different universities and applications and companies on the concept of customer satisfaction and how that drives satisfaction and loyalty. And we were learning, of course, that there's very strong connections from satisfaction to loyalty and profitability. But the question is, what kind of strategies did that lead to? So in my case, I was giving a seminar in the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor at the Ross School, and there was a telecom executive from GTE, now Verizon. And then we started looking at case studies, including a Norwegian fish farming company named Panfish, which is now part of a very large company called Maui. And they got us onto this topic. So when I was teaching this seminar, I was talking about the virtues of customer satisfaction and loyalty and how it increased profitability. And the concept at the time is maybe you want a smaller, what we call a watertight bucket of customers, where the customers aren't constantly leaving the bucket because they're more loyal and profitable, that your most loyal customers would generate most of your profit. And that was all, all well, but it could lead to myopic strategies, which we'll get to. So I'm giving a lecture on this, and one of the executives at GTE, he starts talking about how convinced he is by the logic that we present, and he's going to take this very seriously in his company. And in front of about 35 or 40 executives in the seminar, he says, okay, I'm going to reduce churn or turnover in my cell phone customers by 5%. And I'm going to reduce it from 65% to 60%. And he's just all excited about this. And his colleagues who are in the seminar says, well, that doesn't sound all that impressive. It's only 5%. If you sort of are listening to Professor Johnson, wouldn't you want to take it even lower? And so he starts to explain his business model, and it becomes sort of a blinding glimpse of the obvious for myself. And then I shared this story with Fred, and it got us thinking about this topic. What he said was, okay, I could take it lower, but if I did that, all of a sudden, I might not have millions of customers in my network and thousands of employees that I could employ and hundreds of offices in different parts of the country that I could keep open. My portfolio of customers would get smaller and I would be making less money. My profitability may go up, but not my overall revenues. So we got to thinking about this, that what GTE was really doing was managing a whole portfolio of customers, some of which he had stronger relationships with, some of which weaker relationships with. So then we started looking at a lot of B2B examples because we started looking at these stronger to weaker relationships. And this is very common in business to business environments. And one of the companies we looked at, again, early on, was a company called Panfish. Again, it's now part of Maui, and you may never heard of it, but it is the largest salmon and trout fishing company in the world. They have about $5 billion in revenues and about 25% of the global salmon and trout market. And so we were exploring Panfish at the time, and it turns out they had a very clear segmentation of these relationships across their customer base. And the problem they faced in the catches, so they're running these farms out in the North Sea and in the fjords, and the problem they had was the variance in the quality of the catch. So the catch would include some of the best salmon, of course, but those were the medium-sized salmon. And these are the salmon that fit well into the salmon smokers, that if you have smoked salmon, they have a whole bunch of technology that it takes to be able to smoke the salmon on a large scale. So they had what we came to call partner customers that they had very customized solutions for, where they would sell these medium-sized salmon, which are the prime part of the catch, which fit the technology of these companies. And then they developed a very sophisticated, customized logistics system to get those partners, those fish, at a price point that is more profitable for the company. So they had these partner relationships. And they also had what we came to call friendships. They had larger, for example, larger not just restaurant, but supermarket companies, large chains that would buy the salmon on large scale. And they would buy reliably in volume at a slight margin. So they were friends. But then they all had what was left over in the catch that they sold much more opportunistically to what we came to call acquaintances. So those acquaintances would call the larger or the smaller fish that were left in the catch again, a much more opportunistic basis. So then we saw this in a lot of other B2B companies. We saw suppliers in the Detroit area to the automobile industries. They may have called them A, B, and C customers. They may have called them level 1, 2, and 3 customers. But there was this sort of very reliable sorting of these customers. But they didn't necessarily have a framework for managing these different relationships. So this got us to realize between these examples something we call the value of a large leaky bucket. So what we started to ask ourselves is, what would a company rather have? A small watertight bucket of loyal customers? In fact, companies like LL Bean tried strategies like this. They used this strategy when they realized that 10% of their customers were delivering 90% of their profit. They started just focusing on those loyal customers. The problem they found down the road, a few years down the road, was their profitability was going up, but the size of the bucket was getting smaller. You can talk to airline companies, you can talk to hotel companies, and they know eventually even their most loyal customers, their platinum and gold customers, are going to not travel as much or not stay as much. Their lives are going to change. So the question really comes down to, You do want a larger leaky bucket because you do want customers constantly entering the system, even if you lose some of those. And the reason you want them is twofold. You want them because on the one hand, you do get some, you can build relationships out of that. And we do know that plugging some of the holes in the bucket will be more profitable. But we also know that the weaker relationships do two things. They give you economies of scale. Go back to the GTE executive. He said, I'm not going to have economies of scale unless I have some of those price-driven customers who are constantly coming in and out of my system in my portfolio. But they also form a source of future loyal customers. And we're going to get into this here a little bit as well. If you look, for example, go back to telecom industry, some research that we've done with a colleague named Anders Gustafsson, who's a colleague of Fred's at BI, in telecom, a different telecom context, different country. But we could clearly differentiate between customers who were very willing to stay with a company if they were more satisfied versus those that were always going to switch. So you can start segmenting your customers by how strong or weak the relationships are going to be. And you can start setting strategies around that. So this gets us to what is really the first sort of pillar of this framework we call customer portfolio management. And that is this relationship segmentation scheme. So those of you who had a chance to read our SMR article, this is front and center in the article, and it's this scheme we've been using. And it really boils down to, and again, you'll see a little bit of Michael Porter's work in this between, sort of cost-driven strategies that are based on acquaintances and parity value that are based on volume versus those that are based on more differential value. But in a marketing context, you got to get way beyond that. You got to get into customized value as well. So we think of strangers as customers who may be in your target market, but they're not customers yet. They may have little or no familiarity with you or awareness of your brand. Parity value customers are customers who perceive relatively little significant differentiation among the competitive offerings, and they're buying more on price and availability. For example, when I buy gasoline, it's going to tend to be based on what price I see and whether it's on the more convenient side of the street when I'm going down a busy road. So these are going to be more acquaintance customers. Differential value is when you can start separating yourself from your competitors on quality, making it more attractive, even if that customer is going to pay a little bit more for your product or service. And finally, partners is where you're really developing a more customized solution for your customers. Again, not uncommon at all in B2B, but what's interesting here is it's becoming much more common in B2C, business to consumer environments. In the business to business environments, the researchers in this area would tend to call these relationship specific investments. So there's a lot of investments that a panfish / Maui is going to make when they're working with the salmon smokers in customizing a logistics solution and a product for those purposes. But in a B2C context, with the advent of digital platforms, you're seeing the Amazons, the Googles, the Apples of the world developing platforms that can be much more customized to individuals. And this is a topic that Fred's going to get more into. But this now raises the question of what's your strategy? Is your strategy just to build volume with acquaintances that are constantly leaving the system and you're constantly having to attract new ones? Or are you going to do more of a balancing between the customers, between this customer acquisition and which subset of those customers you want to move through improvements in product, service, quality, for example, to differentiated value, and you want to move to more of a customized solution to customized value and a closer partnership. So there are strategic solutions under this, and I think one of the main takeaways, of this morning's sort of presentation is to avoid myopic strategies. You don't want to be myopic and just focus on one or the other, on volume or on partnerships. It's really a balancing act of how you create value in a portfolio. So other elements of our framework, as I mentioned, the strangers, acquaintances, friends, and partners is sort of where you start. But this was a very complex problem. And we started to get our arms around this problem by doing something, borrowing a method that's really more common in areas like finance and real estate, by doing pro forma analyses. We started modeling what customer conversions were, acquisitions, conversions to closer relationships, switching to competitors. We started modeling what happens to customers over the course of a product life cycle and estimating its value. And we call that CPLV, Customer Portfolio Lifetime Value, where you're looking at the number of customers over the course of a life cycle and their expected cash flow based on what relationship level they're at, they're a new customer or a more loyal customer, based whether they're purchasing more of the product at a higher margin, they're purchasing more products in the category. We're going to get into this notion of leverage here in a second, and what the costs are. One of the things we started to realize, when you're a friend or partner of an Apple or an Amazon, their marketing costs are much lower for someone like you. It's not just, sort of economies of scope, production type costs. It's marketing costs that are lower as well. So we're going to show you a concrete application of this shortly. But when we've literally run probably 1,000 simulations using this model over the years, and it leads to cash flow analyses like the one you're seeing at the bottom of the slide, where over the course of a life cycle, you start by building acquaintances. Some of those acquaintances transition to become friends. A subset of those acquaintances, some will always remain acquaintances. Some transfer to friendships. They have a higher margin, higher cash flow. Some of those transition to partnerships. Again, a subset of the friends transition to partnerships. And by the time you start looking out over the course of the life cycle for this product or service, it's the partners and the friends that are delivering the bulk of the cash flow. Even though it took the building of acquaintances and this balancing of weaker and stronger relationships to maximize the lifetime value of that portfolio. And we'll get to this at the very end of the talk, but it also means that you got to have a lot of people in the room, including the senior leadership of the company and the finance people in the room when you're having these discussions. But as I said, this can be a complex issue. So we had to find a way in our applications of customer portfolio management to simplify this, because it can get very context specific. So we started looking at the questions that executives and managers were asking us along the way. And it boiled down to 3 basic questions that are captured sort of in this diagram. And the first one is, how much do I invest in sort of two-sided, acquiring new customers and moving some of those customers up in this relationship continuum? Again, how do I start segmenting these customers, in my application to be able to get a relationship segmentation scheme and saying, where do I invest in building stronger relationships? Where do I manage the weaker relationships, to scale, for example, to provide myself economies of scale? The second question the executives were asking us was, how do I leverage those relationships once I've invested in this, in these customers? I've made this investment that I'm spending more to sort of invest in building a friend or a partnership. I got these quote unquote relationship specific investments. Now, how do I leverage those? And that's where the ecosystems come in and the cross-selling of products and services and systems. And the third question is, well, how do I at least keep as many? And so that's the last one was relationship leverage. The last one was, how do I defend as many relationships as I can? Because I do want to plug some of the leaks in the bucket. So that gets into CX management, which is customer expectations management, and the process of monitoring product and service quality, its impact on satisfaction and loyalty, and ultimately having that drive things like total quality management, quality function deployment, and other sort of Six Sigma processes in your companies. So this is when we transition over to the ecosystem. So I'm at this point going to turn things over to Fred.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think this was yours, but that's okay. I will do it.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. We'll tag team this one together. I was going to use as an example here this top figure, and this is the acquisition part. In one of our writings, we talk about Amazon. They have a sort of a compound growth rate in recent years of 20% growth in new customers. So they're constantly putting people and making the bucket bigger. At the same time, they're taking a subset of those customers through their predictive modeling and moving them to Amazon Prime. So they become Prime customers. So between 2018 and 2021, they went from 100 million to 200 million of those customers. So yes, this was that example. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the really interesting phenomena these days is what we can call the emergence of products and service ecosystems. And it really reflects the partnering thinking, but it also reflects how digitalization is playing a bigger role in consumer markets, where the idea is that companies like Amazon and Apple and Google, they develop more products, more services that customers link into. So that will give the company, it will get a larger cash flow because it's more products and services involved, but it will also give them a larger duration because the switching costs are increasing. So it's harder to, or not as easy to get out of the relationship, and more costly to get out of the relationship. And then to switch to another supplier becomes very, very complicated. And that also an important thing of that is also that for competitors, it's harder to get these customers. It's harder for Samsung and other mobile suppliers to get an Apple customer because the customers is linked, the potential customers linked to a lot of products and services. So that is a very interesting thing happening now these days in consumer markets with the digitalization, and it also challenges the traditional marketing perspective on positioning, because traditionally marketing has been about coming up with a value proposition for a product and arguing why the customer should choose your product. With this, it's not only about the products, but it's also about the relationships. So what we see is that you should position yourself as a brand, a supplier brand, where you have other elements than just the product benefits. So the framework here is challenging traditional marketing in terms of we need to think about partnering into that. If you also think about the types of relationship we talked about earlier, we have the acquaintances, which is also challenging the traditional marketing perspective, because we thought in marketing that you need to have something different or better to attract customers and to keep them. But if the customers are just happy with convenience or the price, and you have a lot of them, we should also include that in our positioning strategy. So it means that it's more complicated to attract and keep customers than what's originally presented in the marketing theories. So if you go to next, Michael. So this framework is admittedly very theoretical, very conceptual, and when we work with companies, we try to translate that complexity into something we can measure. And this is from a work we've been doing in Norway. It's a retail brand of building materials. It's just where we started, say, okay, so how can we get a picture or a description of our portfolio in terms of friends and acquaintances and partners. So we said, okay, let's do a survey where we do a very rough sort of classification, where we say that partners are those customers who perceive the brand for these building materials to be better than competing brands, and who also purchase more than 50% of their purchases in the category from this brand. One could argue that is it 50% or is it 75%, but we chose 50% just to get the start. The friends, we say, is customers who perceive the brand to be better, but they're not buying. They're buying less than 50%. So okay, they think you're better, but they're not buying so much from you. And then the acquaintances were simply customers who perceive the brand to be equal or worse than competing brands. And as we will see on the next slide, we divided that into high and low share of wallet. So if you go to the next, Michael, thank you. So this is the picture of their portfolio, where we find that 56% of their portfolio, based on the survey, is what we can call acquaintance of type 1. They think you're about the same, not necessarily worse, but you're not better, and you buy less than 50% from this brand. They accounted for 56% of all the customers. If we added also those who perceive the brand as equal, but also bought more, we get another 18%. So observation number 1 here is that 74% of the customers of this brand think they are about the same as the competing alternatives. This was a surprise because they have been systematically trying to differentiate the perception of their brand. But the result was that most customers perceive them to be equal. And notice this is customers who use the brand. We're not talking about the strangers and those who potentially may come into the portfolio. This is just the customers you have. Then we see that 20% of the customers is what we can call partners. They buy more than 50% and they think you're better. So that's the distribution of types of customers, which was interesting by itself. Then we did a calculation of future cash flow from these customers, where we looked at the likelihood that you would continue buying, the amount you were buying, and also the margin that you get from the customers to get the cash flow. And then it turned out that the partners, they had the average partner had a value of more than 3,000 euros, whereas the value of acquaintance in the down left corner had a value of only 466. Also interesting was that acquaintances, top left corner, they were quite valuable, although they didn't buy much, but they bought a lot. So this gave us also some information about the value of the portfolio. So if you go to next, Michael. Thank you. The next thing we did was to look at the distribution of friends and partners across the stores in the chain. And normally you would expect the distribution to be about the same because they have the same products, the same prices, the same marketing, the same layout of the stores. So you wouldn't really expect such a large difference between stores. But what we found was that in one of the stores, 80% of the customers we interviewed said that they were better than competitors, and many of them also bought more than 50%. And then at the other end, we had one store or a couple of stores who only had 10% in that category of friends and partners. The interesting thing here is that when we correlated these numbers for each store with the profitability of each store, the financial performance, it was a very, very high correlation, meaning that when we try to understand what is driving profitability in a store, management would typically look at things about the store, the size of the store, number of parking places, and things like that, rather than what are the perceptions of their customers. And that was started to ask new questions because you get such a large variance. So if you go to next, Michael. So findings then to sum up was that cash flow from partners is about 6 times the value of acquaintances with less than 50% share of the wallet, and twice the value of acquaintances with more than 50%. And that partners account for 45% of the value of the product, of the portfolio, but only 20% of the portfolio. That is by combining the numbers in one of the earlier slides. So if you look at the total value of the portfolio, it comes from 20% of their customers. And the third bullet point is relationship strength varied widely across the stores. So, and that's probably because we think it's differences in management, in the management quality, and also the local competition is varying around in the country. And finally, the correlation between relationship strength and performance. So we're very early on here in the project, but the focus now is on, okay, so how can we improve the low performing stores? Because we want improving the relationship strength is going to also to improve the performance of the stores. So we're looking into that. We use customer information systems to improve performance. And we look at, okay, so what's the difference between the best performing and the least performing to get ideas. And finally, there is also on the innovation table is, okay, so how can we come up with the ecosystem of products and services? How can we more systematically develop some value propositions that will take customers from acquaintances to friends to partners by such things as the loyalty program and so forth. Yes. Okay, next slide, Michael. So finally, what does it boil down to? So CPM recommendations. We think it's a good idea to segment customers by relationship strength. It is, however, different ways to do it, and we have to think carefully or creatively around how can we develop these indicators of our customers. Then to have a thorough and extensive customer information system for the portfolio. We need more information about customers, and we need more information about how they connect with the company in order to understand expected cash flows and so forth. Third is look at the opportunities with digitalization and think how can digitalization be a catalyst for relationship conversion. And that's about developing value proposition, cross-category solutions, and so forth. And finally, I think it's our experience so far is that it's one thing to convince the marketing people that this is a good idea, but the real challenge is to convince and get the buy-in from the board and from the finance people in the organization and for the top level management. So
Fred, I'm going to add some of my own comments here as well. This is, we're finding that this notion of segmenting customers by relationship strength, this is something that really can be very customized, in the context. But I think one of the most interesting thing that's popped out is how robust this 3 levels of relationship is. You can do it sort of, you go talk to the managers and the relationship management people in B2B companies. They intuitively know what these 3 segments are. They know them. I mean, the customized people, there's the people that they used to talk to on a regular basis. They're linked to at the hip. and they work very, very closely with. So it's very intuitive. But even in the business to consumer examples, when we use CRM systems to find these segments, we come up with 3 segments. So it's a very robust thing. The customer information systems, you know, this is a challenge because in the age where everybody's doing surveys and everyone's to manage these things, it can get challenging to make sure you have the resources to be able to and go to the effort to make sure you get good feedback data from your customers and you're analyzing that, and you don't oversimplify the systems. There was a movement at one point in time to take sophisticated systems and simplify them. And no, you need to be able to have good CRM systems to do the kind of sort of net present value calculations that Fred was presenting in the retail example, to understand what's happening to customer paths over time and what their spending levels are over time. So you can start modeling that. And then this digitization, you know, it's really changing the way we think in the businesses. It's changing the way we're teaching our students in academic settings. The cases that we're using to teach them is both an exciting and challenging thing, I think, for people in marketing. And last but not least, you know, this is a topic that, given that we're talking about cash flows over time that are going to determine the future of these companies, everybody needs to be in the room. So Allison, I think we're now moving back.
Excellent. Let's do some questions and answers. Thank you both very much for this really interesting talk. We've had some provocative, I might say, questions come in from the audience and have a few of my own as well. So we'd love to just jump right into that in the back half of our hour here. I think, you know, to start, maybe somewhat simply, you know, oftentimes we wonder, here's a great model. It's really, we see the value of taking an approach like this in an organization. If this is a very new approach or something that an organization hasn't really been thinking about or dedicating resources to, how do you get started? Imagine you want to segment your customers into these 4 groups. How do you think about kicking that off? How do you identify or find them?
Fred, I have a thought here, but I'll let you weigh in first if you want to.
No, I think it's like I showed with the example, is that you try to start simple just to get an idea about what it looks like and how you can operationalize it before you get into to the big strategic decisions. Is you know, what are the sort of opportunities here? What are the situation, or what is the situation? I think that's where you want to start to get sort of a picture, put that way, of your portfolio.
Yeah,
that's
I think
where I would start at least.
Yeah, I would build on that, Fred. I think you're absolutely right. You start simple and build on the things that are already intuitive and to the company, and the company's already doing. So I'm a bit sort of used to doing this in the B2C context, the business to consumer context. And given my background in hospitality and hotel and airline companies, for example, travel and tourism, and you talk to people in the large hotel companies, and they're going to think about a lot of elements of this problem in their own way. And the way they're going to capture these segments is typically in their loyalty programs. So, you know, a Marriott may have 6 levels in their loyalty programs, but those levels, all the way up to titanium and platform Bonvoy members, for example, you can start mapping those, you know, into these segments very easily. They're sort of macro segments that the loyalty segments map into. And then as you get into a conversation about those loyalty programs, you realize they're thinking about aspects of this in the exact same way. They're realizing that those platinum customers aren't going to be with them forever, that they need to start, you know, getting Gen Z customers, for example, who are used to getting rooms from Airbnb, you know, getting their Bonvoy apps on their phone, you know, as they take jobs and start to travel. So they know they have to keep attracting new customers. So the concepts of acquisition, the two sort of levels of conversion, acquiring new customers constantly, not just relying on the customers you already have, but acquiring new customers, about converting some of those customers through things like loyalty programs, and then how to cross-sell them in sort of traditional marketing speak, or what we call sort of leveraging these ecosystems, and of course having good CRM systems to make sure you don't unnecessarily lose those customers.
Great, thank you. I think, Tim, this kind of gets at your question that you put into the chat around loyalty programs, so I won't spend too much time on that, but there is an interesting angle that he raised on this, which was first asking if the model assumes a level of loyalty that, the way he phrased it, could limit its use in companies where loyalty program members might be harder to identify. So I guess the follow-up that makes me wonder about is, would you recommend maybe taking a closer look at your loyalty program, thinking about how you can optimize it for this type of segmentation as possibly a place to start if you're looking to really embrace this model and you haven't in the past?
I think that is exactly what you do. You start looking closer at your own model. And I think one thing to remember here, when we started on this problem, it got so complex because you're mixing business strategy and marketing strategy, right? So it got so complex. We started building these models just so we could understand the dynamics of all the factors. So we could understand, customer acquisition, conversion to different relationships, switching across competitors, what happens to margins, what happens to unit costs, that when you have, what happens, and this is a key variable that we didn't sort of cover conceptually, but is key to underlying this. And this is the notion of customer heterogeneity. How heterogeneous is demand in the market? The more homogeneous the demand, the more you're sort of focusing on those acquaintances and scale and volume. But the more heterogeneous, the needs are in a market, the more opportunities there are for companies to differentiate, and customize. So Allison, we got on the path of the model to sort of literally start sort of modeling out the complexities of these cash flows, not to apply it in the company per se, but rather than to apply elements of it as they make sense. For example, getting into the CRM systems and Fred's example to do, once we know, sort of looking at talking to the executives and looking at the variables we have or can collect in a survey, how we might segment the customers into these segments for that company or that market. Then we might see how we could take elements of the model, like the net present value of partners per se, or friends per se, and then start looking at that. But it just helped us sort of get into, and that's where we started seeing things like the value of a large leaking bucket. And sort of one other interesting tidbit that's in one of our earlier articles, we started seeing what happens when there's shocks in a system. So we just had a huge shock called a pandemic, where you have a huge impact on supply chains that all of a sudden makes things more costly. What does that do to your portfolio? Where we learned through these simulations that it can decimate the value of acquaintances because the margins disappear. But if you're relying on a large lot of acquaintances and your costs go dramatically up, all of a sudden you go from being a profitable organization to an unprofitable organization. But you can't get any economies of scale out of partners because there's not enough of them. So it turns out we found these unique situations where friends were the optimal strategy, sort of an intermediate level. They were sort of this balance of risk and return. But when it gets to the applications of the model, we sort of put those learnings to a side, sort of how we understand these dynamics, and start saying, in the applied case, what are the dynamics of your relationships? How would you describe these different sort of segments? How do you identify them? If you can't, how might we, like doing the kind of survey work that Fred was talking about? Fred, am I making sense there?
Very much.
This response raises so many different angles and nuances and questions I want to ask you, but let's go back to where you were talking about this is a strategic endeavor. right? That it is much broader maybe than organizations are used to thinking about. And this might be an unfair question, but I wonder, do you feel any specific function kind of owns this type of customer development and tracking? So you mentioned engaging senior leaders, bringing multiple functions into the room, avoiding being myopic in your thinking, but does this approach then mean that a function you would traditionally think of as owning the customer experience, the customer journey, like a marketing function or customer acquisition, doesn't fully own this? Or where does responsibility sit, or does it vary based on certain factors that you've identified and analyzed in your research?
Excellent question. I think if we look at the marketing role in companies over the years, I think if we go back to the 60s, that's very, very long time ago, of course, but then marketing was very strategic in many companies. Over the years, the marketing role in many companies has developed into being a role of communication, and then also on communication for recruiting customers into the system. But and nobody really has the responsibility in an organization. If you look at everyone talks about the customer, but if you look at who's responsible for keeping the customer and converting the customer, there's really no one who will pick it up. But I think this is a great opportunity for developing the marketing function. But then we need to think different about what marketing is about. So I think it belongs in marketing, but it's not the type of marketing, the traditional role of marketing. I think marketing has to be redefined. That's a great question.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's, in one of my slides, I give my students in almost every class on marketing. It's a quote from Peter Drucker from 1954. And that quote from Peter Drucker is, marketing, being market-based, is about looking at the entire organization from the customer's perspective. And that is something that has gotten lost, in a lot of applications of marketing as being, sales and advertising, and branding, and it's not limited to that. It really, I think, to Fred and I, is this notion of connecting, business strategy to marketing management. And the links to them. So there are going to be parts in this where marketing can't own the whole thing, though certainly there's parts of it they will. Interesting little case study I think that we also have is a company called, this makes me think of Sector Alarm. When they started realizing they were managing their portfolio, when they started realizing it's a home alarm system company in Europe, very large, and they started realizing that they had a problem with a particular system. So this sort of gets into customer defense, but it led to system-wide sort of integration of a solution. They had an alarm system that was going through batteries quickly, and they were losing customers. They were noticing customer churn, and it led to a cross-functional dialogue from manufacturing, why is this particular system burning through batteries so quickly, to the sales, who were still selling this thing when they really should slow down, to service, to how do we develop service functions that identify when that battery is going to fail, and let the customer know it's going to fail. And by the way, cross-sell them, leverage in an ecosystem a service that will come and change that battery for them. So we've seen some of these examples where it has really helped cut across barriers and sort of helped with this cross-functional solutions to this portfolio management.
What I really like about what you just said too was talking about making the organization customer-centric at its core in a lot of ways, to the Drucker point. Yet at the same time, this is so driven by the direct benefits the organization will receive, right? You're really looking hard at financials when you think about this, and the future of the business in a lot of ways. And you think about the ecosystem and the growth and the partnerships you might create, or even just the cross-functional selling that you're talking about. It really becomes this holistic approach that's extremely strategic, yet appears to the customer as completely prioritizing their needs. So I think that's a really interesting balance that you're navigating, as you think about what your go-to-market messaging looks like versus what you're talking about behind the scenes, and how you're optimizing this, and the kind of almost factory going on underneath the hood of all of this to make it happen. So let me jump to so many things I want to ask you in so little time. I have a selfish interest. I think our audience does as well in the technology aspect of this. So of course at MIT Sloan Management Review, we care a lot about how technology and management work together, how they inform each other. You mentioned briefly, one of the levers you can pull is thinking about predictive or AI ML, in some of this. Maybe there are elements that can be automated. I'm just curious, are there any really solid examples you could share about an organization using these tools to optimize their modeling on this?
I think, I mean, I can think of one right offhand, and I know Fred, may have one as well, but one of the cases, there's a case by a guy named Dave Chaffee that he keeps online about Amazon, which, I have my students read. And there's a great picture sort of in that case where it talks about the ecosystem of customers underneath the product. It literally has a product life cycle and ecosystem of customers. And on top of it, what is an incredibly complex set of predictive modeling procedures and AI-based techniques that Amazon uses over the course of this, and different tools where customers are at different points in this life cycle. So it starts out with sort of, incredibly complex infrastructure that companies like Amazon have built up, but you can simplify it down and start more simply in terms of, if you have the basics of a CRM system and customer surveys, you can start looking at, the variance in customers' experiences in those feedback systems, how they're impacting satisfaction, and how that's impacting, for example, their loyalty and profitability. You can start running some of those models, even with relatively, less sophisticated systems, I would say. There's even environments, we talked about, B2B versus B2C, and B2B, sometimes you don't have enough customers to run the kind of models that an Amazon's going to run with millions of customers. So you have to do it much more intuitively and much more at a grassroots level. So you, again, I think, come down to this principle of customizing it to the context of the company and the market they're competing in, and it doesn't have to involve complex modeling. It can involve, a framework. Again, Fred, I'm thinking about when we encounter these environments, these applications, how the executives say, who do I convert? Right? Who do I convert? Okay, I made an extra investment. Now, how do I leverage it? What can I cross-sell them? And how do I not lose as many customers as possible? That's a way of taking, again, the complex system and simplify it.
I agree. I think the questions we're asking here should drive the development of prediction models and algorithm. I think that is very important.
Yeah.
And also be aware that to succeed here, you to combine different sources of data. You can use transaction data. You can use also combine that with interaction data. How much are you involved with an app and so forth? How have you downloaded things? You can combine that with competitors in living close to the customer, where the customer is. Differences there, and then on top of that, we also need to get into the psychology of the customer. So we need once in a while to get some information about their thinking. We can do a lot of prediction based on behavior, but to get to the really deep level, we need also some sort of survey type of feedback where we ask, what is your opinion? How do you think about things? I think, and it's the combination of these different sources that can make the really effective management information system to this.
Let me add one more thing, Allison, and that is, even if a company hasn't, developed a sophisticated system, they should go down that path, as Fred said, but they should monitor the digital environment.
Yes.
You can, so when my students do projects and classes, they don't necessarily get asked back to a hotel's confidential information, but they can look on Yelp and download thousands of reviews that are detailed on individual hotels.
Exactly.
So my guess is that these companies can start, by looking at, there is feedback on them out there. How do we start capturing it and turning some of that data into information?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for predicting what our audience is asking in your answers. I think it just speaks to the really interconnectedness of all of this and the different topic areas or disciplines that this touches on. I mean, I'm getting questions about psychology, neuroscience, technology. I wanted to ask Hugo's question, which is, if you think about other non-financial activities being added to your model with customer engagement, you've already hit on some of that, right? You're talking about these qualitative or unstructured data sets, if you will, with hotel reviews, for example, surveys to actually get firsthand what sentiment is. I guess to indulge him a little bit, are there any other elements of non-financial behaviors or activities that you might coach a company to think about, or a tool you might use to capture those?
I have one thing that I think is if you can get into how the customer is connected to others as a very important, because it's not only the ecosystem, but it's the network around that ecosystem, which I think is very, very important to understand. So, for example, a simple thing like buying a car. Car industry typically look at the individual car buyer, but in most cases, most households has at least 2 cars and 2 people, and so maybe they have more, but it's the household and how is the usage of the car in the household. So what is your correct perspective on the customer? Is it the buyer, the one who writes the contract, the driving the car, or is it the household? And if it's the household, you need informant thinking. You know who's informing us about the household. But the point is that go beyond the relationship and think about how the customer is connected to other products and services and brands and associations and so on.
Yeah, there's an academic, one of our colleagues, Susan Fournier, who's done some great work on consumer communities. People like Tom Mulgun here at Wisconsin, who's done work on that as well. And this is something that sort of has been in the consumer research literature, but it's making its way now. And practitioners need to start paying attention to it, because it gets exactly into this issue that Fred's talking about. What's the community? We're used to thinking about the firm and the connections that the firm has. But what's the customer? What connections do they have? Not just to the firm, but other individuals in the consumer community. And it sort of leads to a concept that gets called the consumer work. What is the work the customer has to do to actually be a customer of the firm, be a consumer of the firm, which comes into play when we start talking about ecosystems. So some of the research we're actually working on now revolves around this notion of, the adaptation of customers in these communities to these digital systems that companies are setting up.
We have just a couple minutes left. I think I can squeeze in one final question, and I'd like to move to measurement. So imagine we've started to do this work in our organization. Are there specific KPIs you would point to as you get started? Like, what are you measuring? What are you reporting on that's really making you know that you're doing this right?
Oh, I have a pet peeve I can talk about.
Please.
I think Fred shares this one. Don't use top box scores. People, have come to love top box scores because they're easy. But what you're really playing off in these measurement systems, when we talk about developing more sophisticated systems, you have to, any statistician would tell you the most important piece of information in any data set is the variance. Not the means and the medians, it's the variance. Why is one customer having a good experience and another customer having a bad experience? So you got to play on that variance. So you need sensitive measures. You need, measurement, and this would sort of take us into some of the modeling procedures, which we won't have time to do, but you need to use techniques that can help you even develop even more sensitive measures. And when you start taking what are distributions where most people are 4s and 5s on a scale, and you say 98% of your people are in the top box, you just threw out all the information you need to do the analysis.
I agree. I just wanted to add one thing, is that you need to think about KPIs that are forward-looking and not backward-looking. So don't look at sales of a customer or historical profitability, but try to predict the future, something that about the future. For example, the customer satisfaction is pointing forward, and a number of other. So that I think is very important, that we try to develop KPIs that is pointing forward, what is going to happen with these customers.
Great. Well, thank you both. That's all the time we have today, unfortunately. Maybe offline I will send you my 10 other questions that I would like to talk about. Fred and Michael, I want to thank you both for sharing these fantastic insights, for answering audience questions and everything. Really, really fascinating discussion. For our audience, I'll let you know that we will be sharing today's slides and access to the on-demand recording within a few business days, so you will have that handy very soon. And to our sponsor, Five9, I'd like to thank you for your support as well. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.